Welcome to Show Don't Tell. Today we're going to talk the thin gruel of politics, poverty in the United Kingdom. We'll see how benefit cuts exploit poverty statistics, garbage data on poverty used for policy making, and government incompetence worthy of Yesminster. This is Show Don't Tell, so play the music. Let's start with the most common poverty measure, the one often used in headlines, relative poverty. Relative poverty is founded on this graph, the distribution of equivalised household income in the United Kingdom. The graph counts the number of individuals in earning increments of £520 a year, ranging from 0 to £52,000 on the x-axis, and the height of each bar indicating the number of people within each increment. The numbers at the bottom indicate income deciles. Each decile represents 10% of the population, and they're numbered from 1 as the poorest to 10 as the wealthiest. Household income is a mixture of benefits and income from employment, and generally speaking, the lower your earnings, the more significant benefits become. In the bottom 20% of households, benefits make up around half of total household income, whereas at the median level, benefits contribute just 20%. Relative poverty is defined relative to the median household income, which is £25,700 a year. The threshold for relative poverty is defined as a household income 60% of this median. In 2017, that was £15,400 per annum, with 16% of the population living in relative poverty. The relative poverty line is also a proxy for inequality or just economic growth in general, because as people with jobs benefit from a stronger economy, the median line increases, moving the poverty line upwards and increasing the number of people in poverty. That's why it's called relative poverty. And the relative poverty line is an absolute determinant of poverty. If you earn just £1 more, you're not considered to be in poverty. £1 less, and you are. But the primary madness of relative poverty comes from the arbitrary cliff edge that is the relative poverty line. Governments are incentivised to move people just above it, and are punished only if people cross the line and move below. The poverty line is drawn in the second decile, so if you were being really cynical, you would increase benefits to people inside the second decile to move them just over the line. You could then cut benefits to people in the third and fourth decile, but only enough that they don't fall below the poverty line. There have been a few changes to benefits in the last year, so let's have a look at them by decile to see what happened. And what a surprise, most of the benefit cuts were targeted at the third and fourth decile, and the slight improvements came just to the second decile. And forget it if you're unfortunate enough to be in the first decile, there's no statistical incentive to help you, because you won't make it up and across the poverty line. But it gets even worse. All of that data, all of those nice charts are knowingly and fundamentally inaccurate. The data is not derived from any official government statistics, rather from a survey of 20,000 households called the Family Resource Survey. Now, we know the government distributes benefits of around £214 billion, but when we extrapolate the data from this survey, it comes to just £170 billion. That's a gap of £40 billion, 20% of the entire benefits in the United Kingdom. This gap can be quantified in more detail. Housing benefit is underreported by 22% or £5.3 billion. Tax credits are underreported by 29% or £7.8 billion. In 2013, the DWP authored a gloriously ironic working paper into why this was the case. With over 41 benefits whose names and thresholds are constantly changing, the DWP system is so confusing people don't understand which benefits they actually receive. The questions are poorly laid out. The DWP isn't used to the idea that in a survey, dealing with incompetence becomes voluntary, not mandatory. And after rounds of benefit witch hunts, people are apprehensive about giving the information at all. And what does all of this mean? Well, considering that those in poverty receive the most benefits, the Resolution Foundation estimates this reduces the overall level of poverty by 20% from the government figures. That's an inaccuracy of over 2 million people. I don't raise this issue because having 8 million people in poverty rather than 10 million is any kind of achievement, rather that when making government policy, no correction is applied. Poverty is consistently mistargeted, and those cuts to the third and fourth decile are far more significant when we look at the statistics of an alternative measure of poverty, material deprivation. Material deprivation is often the things that fill the headlines: people using food banks, people going cold, people going hungry. Material deprivation is also assessed in the Family Resource Survey, probably more accurately as it's just a yes or no question, but we can compare these answers to the relative poverty income deciles. For instance, how many people say they can't afford a warm winter coat for their children? The answer is fortunately very low, just 1% overall, and just 2% in the poorest 20% of the population. How about not being able to afford a week away from home with the family? This is much more common. 32% of the population can't afford this, and it's 50% of the lowest income group. And finally, not being able to afford to replace broken electrical goods. 20% of the population as a whole, and 35% of the lowest income group. Now, which of these measures you think best constitutes poverty is entirely up to you. However, I'll highlight what I mentioned earlier, that third and fourth decile. None of these people are viewed as being in poverty, and they've been impacted the most by benefit cuts in recent years. Now look at their material deprivation numbers compared to those in poverty at the first and second decile. They're hardly different at all. So not only is relative poverty measured inaccurately, income itself is flawed as a direct measure of poverty. People should never fixate on a single poverty metric. Relying on a simplistic measure like relative poverty incentivizes these tragic outcomes like cutting benefits to people in material deprivation because there is no statistical penalty for doing so. And if you think taking another approach, say explicitly targeting those families most in need with say £450 million to improve their lives would produce a benefit, well clearly you are not familiar with the Troubled Families Programme. The Troubled Families Programme was the government's flagship scheme to improve the lives of impoverished people. Launched in 2012, the scheme closed in 2015. Now, I have to say, at first glance, I quite liked the Troubled Families Programme. It encompassed a lot of what I would do if I had to run a similar scheme. Limit the amount of people you're trying to target, fund the scheme generously, and give autonomy to the people implementing it so they can use their initiative. However, and it's a big one, the funding was on a payment by results basis. Local authorities tasked with delivering the scheme would only get money if their intervention was successful, a system which creates some rather poor incentives. When the scheme closed and the results were announced, there was fanfare, great success. 99% of families had been turned around. £9 billion saved by the Treasury. However, there was also a certain amount of scepticism. Reporters alleged that many turned around families had never even been contacted, and an independent consultancy was commissioned to investigate the findings of the scheme. And their report is possibly one of the most depressing things ever created. It's also written in bureaucratese, which reaches lofty heights when describing failure. However, I can make some translations for you. So, over 3 years and £450 million, what did the Troubled Families Programme manage to achieve? Well, the report says, the expected relationship between intensity and impacts did not materialise. In English, this means, we didn't actually improve anyone's lives, though we did claim £450 million on the basis that we did. But what about this 99% success rate? Well, as the report notes, local authorities were also acutely aware of the importance from a financial perspective of achieving their PBR target, which was further reinforced by a clear message from CLG that they were expected to achieve these targets. This translates as, We needed the money, and if we showed the programme was successful, the government wasn't going to ask too many questions how that came about. This is the great issue with payment by result, especially if gaming the system is far easier than doing the work of delivering the outcomes. And oh yes, games were played. As the report notes, others reportedly looked to claim PBR outcomes retrospectively from across a wider pool of families who were affiliated to the local programme. In English, this means we found families who are out of poverty now, but were in poverty when the scheme was announced, so we claimed they'd been part of the scheme all along to get the money without actually doing anything. And the top bullet point in the list of the scheme's achievements reads, the national spotlight at a policy level, coupled with the additional government funding, helped to raise the profile of family intervention, which means we didn't achieve anything other than people knowing we were trying to achieve something. This was our only actual achievement. As I said before, this was one of the most depressing things that I've ever read. The government was willing to distribute £450 million, £4,000 per family, with freedom of how people went about helping troubled families, and the result was a complete waste of time and money. What was the consequence of all this incompetence? Well, naturally the programme was expanded, unchanged, because they made the decision before this report was finalised. Poverty is a complex issue, but I don't believe focusing on simple and inaccurate metrics does anything to help solve it. It's the statistical equivalent of gerrymandering. It incentivises political games rather than actually trying to benefit society. There's very little focus on the lack of adult education or qualifications, which could have been a solution under the Troubled Families programme. But as the programme showed, even when we try, we achieve nothing, something which should be investigated further. It's a fundamental flaw with how the ideal of eliminating poverty in the UK will ever translate into reality. Anyway, that brings us to the end of today's episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Feel free to like, subscribe, or just watch some of my other videos, and I'll see you next time.